I feel that when I say Headless heroics, most of us can cite a famous example. Can any of the high schoolers think of a heroic Sikh warrior who fought without his head? Baba Deep Singh, right? Most of us have heard of this story, and we were told this story when we were kids, maybe 4 or 5 years old. We're told to admire the determination and the bravery championed by Baba Deep Singh. And all these virtues are visually embodied in the iconic image of an 80-year-old man fighting his way to the Darbar Sahib, head in hand. Right? The goal of this presentation is to delve into the iconography, the meaning, and the depth behind the symbolism of this particular cultural reference. Thus, my talk is entitled Headless Heroics. And to do this, I want to look at the story of Kharag Singh. So Kharag Singh is a mythological story, and it's written within the Dasam Granth. So Kharag Singh is not a historical person. At the age of 9, Guru Gobind Singh received his father's head, his father's severed head, Guru Tegh Bahadur, at Anandpur Sahib. This sparked a transformative time period for the community. There was a unique pressure upon Guru Gobind Singh, unlike the previous gurus. On one side, you had the Mughal Empire, which was standing over the community and was culpable for the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur. On the other side, you had the Hill Rajas, the local kingdoms, which saw the Guru as a threat to their security and prosperity. Internally, you also had the corruption of the community leaders, the Masands, which were taking advantage of the community. But he also had internal disputes, Sikhs that were claiming the status of Guruship, and who were actually writing their own literature in contention against Guru Gobind Singh. So it's in this charged atmosphere that a transformation took place. And that energy spilled over in a multitude of ways. Right? The literature that was formed during that period is just one manifestation of this, namely the Dasam Granth. For philologists, or those who study texts, and also historians, this presents us with an interesting problem. How do we read these compositions within the Dasam Granth? Although a lot of scholarship, modern scholarship, is contended over the issue of authorship of the Dasam Granth, whether Guru Gobind Singh Ji wrote it, whether rather he commissioned it by his court poets, this is not germane to my talk, because what I want to look at is the purpose of its formation and its subsequent effect it had on the community. And in that regard, the historical writings of the 18th, the 19th century are quite clear that the Sikhs of those time periods believed that the writings of the Dasam Granth were written by Guru Gobind Singh. And this is why these texts present interesting opportunities for researchers, especially the compositions within the Dasam Granth that are vernacular retellings of old Sanskrit classics, like the Valmiki Ramayana, which is represented in the Dasam Granth as the Ram Avatar, or the Bhāgavata Purāṇa, which is represented as the Krishna Avatar. The situations that Guru Gobind Singh Ji was dealing with were very complex, and this is represented in the layering and the complexity of the writings themselves. They are not so easily mappable to simplified historical narratives. But we can see that these writings are putting forward ideals of behavior that transcend the political situation. One way of reading these texts is to identify unique portions within the plot lines of these retellings. Parsing out a section or story helps us to shed light on the underlying ideologies that are in play and that get used to define certain ideas about bravery, warrior duty, and notions of victory and defeat. And it's with this thought in mind that I began to examine the story of Kharag Singh, which I found to be a story which outlined the important characteristics and ideals of what it meant to be a warrior. This is important because these stories, like Kharag Singh, were just one component of how the community became more militarized during that transformative period. We know that this story of Kharag Singh was so important that it gets mentioned in a 1769 historical text called the Bansavali Nama, written by Kesar Singh Shibur, in regard to the duty of a warrior. The text mentions a dialogue between Guru Gobind Singh and several high-ranking Brahmins. And in that discussion, the Guru quotes a passage from Kharag Singh, speaking about the duty of a warrior. This is important because I believe this peculiar story of Kharag Singh to be emblematic of the core warrior spirit that Guru Gobind Singh wanted his brotherhood of Khalsa warriors to uphold. Kharag Singh possessed the indomitable spirit, fighting the good fight, and he did not miss a beat, even when his head was decapitated. The story of Kharag Singh is only around 350 verses, and like I mentioned, is recorded within the Dasam Granth, which is organized by compositions. Specifically, the tale is found within the composition of the Jobi Saptar, which is the 24 incarnations of Vishnu. And Kharag Singh's story falls within the Krishna Avatar, which is the portion of that that's related to Krishna. So the Jobi Saptar is one of the largest components of the Dasam Granth, and the Krishna Avatar is the largest component of the Jobi Saptar. The Krishna Avatar is a rendition of the 10th chapter of the Bhāgavata Purāṇa, and these retellings present an exciting field of examination for any aspiring philologist, because these retellings are not a line-by-line translation. So many questions arise. What was translated? What was not translated? Or what was added in to that translation? And this is why the Kharag Singh is especially important, because it does not find any mention in the original Bhāgavata Purāṇa. So this is a unique composition that was added in. The Krishna Avatar is a martial text, unlike the original 10th chapter of the Bhāgavata Purāṇa, which is largely known for its Ras Leela, the stories of love between Krishna and the gopis. In contrast, the end of the Krishna Avatar mentions the purpose of its composition, which was none other but to arouse the desire for righteous warfare, or dharam yudh. In the same light, the story of Kharag Singh is a martial text, and it comes from a tradition called Raso poetry, whereby poets would write in Braj Bhasha and mix in mythological and historical narratives into a fluid blend for the entertainment and inspiration of kings and chieftains and warriors alike. The literary tradition of Braj Bhasha is particularly relevant to the construction of much of the Dasam Granth. The language itself provided a unique mechanism to blend in both Persian and Sanskrit words. And in a way, Braj Bhasha was not only a bridge linguistically, but also culturally. It particularly became popular alongside Drupad music styles, which flourished in the court of Akbar and grew in popularity until the 19th century. So Guru Gobind Singh used this courtly literary tradition at his disposal when writing this tale. But I hypothesize that he also drew on his personal experience in shaping and forming this archetypal, indomitable Sikh warrior. We know the young Guru was 9 years old when he received his father's head at Anandpur Sahib. We must infer that this was a very influential moment in his life. As we know, some years later, when forming his new brotherhood, the Khalsa Panth, what did he ask for? He asked for 5 heads. The powerful idea that one's warrior duty required that one put it all on the line was represented in this sacrifice. But actually, in fact, this type of imagery comes from a long tradition of Sanskrit literature as well, which has used this imagery so much that it has a specific Sanskrit word for headless fighting body, kabanda. This imagery becomes important as the story unfolds itself. So Shinamasta is probably the most famous example of this from Sanskrit literature. So I'll give you a brief summary of the Kharag Singh story. Kharag Singh's story is situated within the Krishna Avatar, where an enemy of Krishna, Jvala Singh, is laying siege to Krishna. Kharag Singh is a friend of Jvala Singh and goes to war on his behalf. Kharag Singh starts the battle and defeats many warriors from Krishna's army, and it's not soon after that that the gods come down, such as Indra, Shiva, Ganesh, and they all challenge Kharag Singh, but Kharag Singh sends them in retreat. One particularly interesting point of the original Bhāgavata Purāṇa is when foreigners, the militia, or the barbarian armies come and fight against Krishna. However, this gets flipped around in the story of Kharag Singh. The militia army doesn't fight against Krishna. In fact, they come to Krishna, and they in fact kind of traitor. They ask to fight for Krishna against Kharag Singh. And why is this important? I mean, to give it a little context, 2 years prior to the completion of the Krishna avatar, 4 battalions of Pathans, 400 warriors, betrayed the Guru, and they fought against Sikh forces at the Battle of Bangani, and ended up fighting with the Hill Rajas. So this portion of the story may have been a creative outlet, representing the betrayal suffered by Guru Gobind Singh. However, Kharag Singh was not deterred and successfully defeated the militia armies. It's at this point that all the gods assemble and conspire against Kharag Singh. And through a variety of ways of distraction and deception, Kharag Singh loses his focus. And in that one moment of vulnerability, Krishna fires an arrow that beheads Kharag Singh. However, without any hesitation, Kharag Singh picks up that head, throws it at Krishna, knocking him out, and Krishna falls off his chariot. Kharag Singh then goes to Shiva and slaps Shiva down to the ground. After seeing this, the armies of Krishna and Shiva, they retreat. And Kharag Singh sits down and absorbs himself in meditation. This mixing of bhakti and warrior duty is mentioned throughout the story. But this particular component is important because we see effects of this today with more modern stories of Guru Gobind Singh finding time in battle to sit down and sing Asa Di Vaar. So Kharag Singh, when the armies regather and fight against Kharag Singh again, he sends them again in their retreat. And Kharag Singh only stops fighting when all the gods, Krishna, Shiva, they all assemble and they submit defeat before Kharag Singh. Actually, one noteworthy aside is the bravery shown by a warrior called Ajit Singh in the story. And it's interesting because Sahibzada Ajit Singh, Guru Gobind Singh Ji's eldest son, was only a toddler when this was written, around 1 year old. He's actually one of the only warriors that it doesn't specifically mention that he's defeated when he fights against Kharag Singh, and it praises his bravery. At the end of the story, Kharag Singh and his origin story is explained by Krishna, who's questioned by his older brother, Balarama, as to who Kharag Singh actually was. Krishna explains to his brother that it was through a boon from Shiva that Kharag Singh received his power. And he promised to destroy the ego of the clansmen of Krishna. These clansmen thought that they had the protection of Krishna, and in not fearing anyone else, they became egotistical and proud. Krishna then reveals his internal connection with Kharag Singh, remarking that the highest Lord destroys ego, and that he is no different than Kharag Singh himself. This follows similarly with themes from the writings of Guru Gobind Singh, from the writings of the 24 Avatar, the incarnations of Vishnu, to the Bachitra Natak, to the incarnations of Brahma as well. There's a common hatred for kings and their pride. This does not seem far-fetched when you think of the circumstances that Guru Gobind Singh was facing. He had extremely negative relations with the local Hill Rajas at the time. It was in fact those Hill Rajas that Guru Gobind Singh Ji first engaged with militarily. There's no surprise then within the court of Guru Gobind Singh, the compositions being sung were those that geared at inspiring warrior spirit, reinforcing norms of bravery and devotion, and espousing a unique sense of sovereignty. Like I mentioned before, the notion of blending bhakti elements into this martial poetry was important for the story of Kharag Singh. But it's also important to the whole composition of the Krishna avatar itself, which the Kharag Singh story emerges out of. And the quote here is the passage that concludes the Krishna avatar. Blessed is that person who in this world keeps Hari on their mouth and contemplates war. One's body will not remain. It is not permanent. Praise of Hari is the boat which shall take you across the terrible ocean of existence. Make one's body the abode of perseverance. Enlighten that abode with the lamp of intellect. Take in hand the broom of knowledge and sweep away the dirt of cowardice. If there's one thing that's congruent within the retellings of Sanskrit literature in the Dasam Granth, is that there's a clear emphasis on carving out ideals of what it means to be a warrior. And the effects of these texts are long-standing within the community. For this reason, a closer examination into the Dasam Granth might be able to shed more light on the transformative period that took place within the community, even in the 17th century. Although Reinhardt and other scholars have very precisely outlined the debates surrounding the Dasam Granth, further comparative analysis needs to be undertaken to inform us on the underlying ideologies that helped form notions of militancy in the Sikh community. Thank you.
Can I invite the previous panel to, those that just presented, to come take a seat? Although each touch on different subjects, I think in some ways that may have come out during the presentation, but definitely came out as they shared their papers, is that, in some in more explicit ways and some in more implicit ways, is the role of Guru Gobind Singh, those that writings were whether authored, whether commissioned, or as Guru Gobind Singh even as a subject, come out in some ways in all three papers. So my goal as an initial discussion when I pose some of the questions is actually to try to get some of the panelists to actually talk to one another to see what are questions of conversation, contention, or potentially even overlap between the three papers. So to begin with, Sonia, of course, was able to at least display a wide variety of images of Guru Gobind Singh as a subject, some even potentially from the period itself, especially an image that was both in her presentation as well as that of Sukhdeep's. And so sort of an initial question, and I'm going to pose a series of questions before turning it over to the panel who we'd actually rather have we'd rather listen to than myself, is in what ways has Guru Gobind Singh's sort of image you've seen sort of transform over times? What are subjects in different periods that you saw had certain more valence in a certain period of time, and which subject matters have sort of been lost? What are images of Guru Gobind Singh that were considered significant at some periods and maybe less so at others? With Sukhvinder's topic, looking at the question of Virag, William Pinch has written quite a bit, and this is in some ways to bring into conversation with some of the things that Sukhdeep was talking about, is Viragis as sort of warrior traditions within sort of broadly what I'll call Hindu ascetics. Although this is not limited to that, people like Richard Eaton have written quite a bit about something called Sufis that are often at the leading of expeditions, both in terms of whether it be in conquest or even in developing new lands, especially in Bangladesh or even in Punjab. So I would love to hear sort of in what ways does that sort of overlap, this sort of, what I'll broadly call a warrior ethos, and see if that term, is that something you'd agree with or disagree with in terms of how the idea of Virag also plays a role or doesn't play a role in that. And with Sukhdeep, our last presentation, where he, probably for the first time talked about this figure of Kharag Singh, which many of you may have heard of or may not have heard of, and he gives an overlapping and overwhelming amount of data in terms of how he kind of concludes that one shouldn't only focus on questions of authorship, but we should actually look at the content of the Dasam Granth itself. I'll kind of reveal sort of my own bias in terms of where we have such a huge corpus of literature from at least the time of Guru Gobind Singh. And language politics seems to be playing a big role in there. I looked specifically in a paper I had written at the Hajuri Ratnama, sometimes incorrectly called the Jvala Singh Ratnama, where language is actually being contested in terms of what in that case, what the Sikhs themselves generally seem to, even in dialogue form, tend to speak Punjabi, while what are called the Musadde Sikhs, which generally came from, they weren't born within the tradition, but kind of adopted the traditions oftentimes as poets, scribes, who very much speak a sort of Braj-inflected language. So, although you've talked about Braj as a possible bridge, I'd also love to hear some of your thoughts as Braj as a limitation as well. What is the imagination that a Braj opens up, but also what does it close off? And since you presented so much, such a great amount of data in terms of why this is sort of central and interesting threads that one can do with it as they like in terms of Ajit Singh as a figure, and is there valence there with Sahibzada Ajit Singh? But I also like to say as like we put it for any hypothesis, can it also be falsifiable? So I'd love to hear if you also had some data that you're still kind of wrestling with that may not fit the schema yet, but you're still sort of thinking through as well. So we'll turn it over to the panel for some initial thoughts, and then it'll be open to the entire audience.
Excuse me. So, thank you, Nandi, for putting it all together so well. And your question, which was for me, was how the portrayal of Guru Gobind Singh has evolved or progressed from our earlier paintings that we have to what are the contemporary arts. And the earlier paintings, the older artworks that we have, are mostly portraiture. And they are expressions of the artist, whereas that artist is informed by the society at that time, the culture, the norms, the fashion, and the backdrop that the artist visualizes the Guru in. But as we progress to more contemporary artworks, we see that, I perceive it that way, is it has evolved to now the portrayal of the Guru is more on what values we want to project, what are the sacrifices that were made in his lifetime, or what is the message that we want to give. So those subjects or those messages are more and more used by the artists, whether it is the Sahibzadas who are shown in the picture, or his martial spirit as well, and the lifetimes, and what are the messages or the teachings that we want to give out. So we saw those in the paintings by Devinder Singh as well, in which the story is trying to be portrayed in that particular paintings. So this is my perception of it. And unfortunately, we don't have very many older paintings in all the collections all over the world. In a very fragile medium, most of it is not available. And also that during the Guru's lifetimes, probably there were not very many actual portraits made. Most of them that we have are from the Punjab Hills School of Paintings, and most of them were done during the period of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, when the patronage to the artists was provided by the court of Lahore. Thank you. Okay.
If I got your question correctly about sort of how does Vairag and sort of the saint soldier aspect, how they sort of intermingle. I think they definitely do, and as Sukhi was talking about how in Krishna Avatar it's talking about Dharam Yudh and also Bhakti at the same time, so they definitely do play a role. So Vairag isn't that you only, as I was mentioning, you just don't become a force stover. The entire point is that you're still a Christi, that you're still living in this world and you're still a saint soldier. And sort of just addressing something that you hinted towards about there being sort of research done on Vairag and these sorts of things outside of Sikhi. So I forgot to mention this in my presentation, is that within Sikhi, Vairag isn't mentioned. There hasn't been a lot of research done on it in the Western world. So that is why I was looking at traditional sources. Now the next step for me is sort of expanding that towards other sources in the other religions I have looked at Vedog.
So, if I understand your question correctly of Braj Bhasha and how it opened up avenues for Sikhs who were writing, but also, did it close any down? Definitely, it opened it up in terms of the currency of Braj Bhasha at that time. In the 18th century, it was very high. So you had in courts Braj Bhasha being sung. You had writings, poems in it. So it was easy to see how the writings of the Dasam Granth were framed in that context. And there's a lot of work being done on this by actually Julie Vidge, who was also at UBC, and the strategy around Braj Bhasha, why it was used, and why the type of imagery within the Dasam Granth and Braj Bhasha was being used to maybe connect with and as a strategy to help recruit from Vaishnava communities. But in regards to closing, the Gurbalas literature from the 18th century, the historical writings, were definitely in Braj Bhasha. But some of the Dasam Granth is not in Braj Bhasha as well. You have Persian writings like the Hakarita at the end of the Dasam Granth, which are short stories. But you also have the Zafarnama, and much of Braj is mixing in Persian words as well. So it's not just, one cannot think of it just as a classical Hindi, right? So definitely there needs to be further research into what was the strategy being used by authors who were writing in Braj Bhasha. Because that also, why did it stop, right? Why did Sikhs stop writing in Braj Bhasha around the 19th century, early 20th century? So that's something that Anne Murphy has talked about as well in some of her books, which is interesting. You have authors like Gyani Gyan Singh, who wrote his Pantaprakash, the Bhim Pantaprakash, in Braj Bhasha. But later on, once that time period was also very transformative during the Singh Sabha movement. At the later end of that, he stopped writing in Braj Bhasha and just wrote in Punjabi. And that's a trend that didn't just happen in Punjab, that happened throughout India. And you see the decline of Braj. If anybody wants to read up on that, Alison Bush has written a really good book, Poetry of Kings, on that. Secondly, in regard to Ajit Singh, much of my work here, that Ajit Singh thing was just an aside. If it's falsifiable, it's just a hypothesis that, you can, philologists, it's interesting when you dive into a text, you try to see what the author was thinking, what's the context of how he was writing it, and maybe this is an aside to his young son, right? He's 1 year old, and he wants to inspire his son with his writings, and you can definitely, we have historical accounts about how the Krishna, how the Dasam Granth was being recited in the court of Guru Gobind Singh. So little Ajit Singh would have been walking around and listening to it, and when his name is mentioned and the bravery about a character called Ajit Singh, and it's just a hypothesis. And there's other moments in, particularly the Kargaseng, the story of Kargaseng, like the Pathans, and when I mention these type of things to my professors at university, and how because Krishna Avatar is a retelling of a Sanskrit tale, there would be no need for mentioning Pirs, Saids, like Islamic names are being used to describe warriors who Kargaseng is battling. And that in itself is interesting as to why, if it was purely just a Sanskrit retelling, why is it not true to the original, right? And it's, this type of research is interesting, so then you can kind of see the kind of mindset of who was authoring these texts, or who was having these texts authored.
Next, we open it up to the audience.
There's a couple of questions here, so I'll just kind of say it all and then address them. So is Vairag meditation or a place reached by meditation? And then the second is, what is Viraha? And the third is Jivana Mukti heaven or salvation? So try to answer these as best as possible. So is Vairag meditation or a place reached by meditation? I would say that it's both. So Vairag, when you're in the state of Vairag, you are trying to meditate on that one. And is it a place reached by meditation? I would argue yes. If you look towards the life of the ninth Guru, Sri Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji Maharaj, they were in that Vairag state. And how did they sort of reach that? It was, if I'm not mistaken, is it 26 years of Bhakti that they did? And so I would say that it's both. What is Biraha? If you were to look at that Shabd in its entirety, I think we would completely understand what Biraha is. So I encourage everyone to sort of look at that Shabd, Kali Kor Tuket Guna Kali. If you look at that, so if I were to sort of shortly answer what Biraha is, I would say that it's a pain of separation. Where you have this pain and you're longing for the one, and you sort of have this regret that you've sort of missed the opportunity to connect to that one and merge with that one. And then thirdly, is Jivan Mukti heaven or salvation? This isn't something that I've sort of looked at yet, but I can try my best to answer it. Is Jivan Mukti heaven or salvation? I would say Jivan Mukti. Mukti means that you're sort of liberated. So that it's Jivan, that in this life, you've liberated from the cycle of birth and death, and you've sort of merged with the one. I hope that sort of answers your questions.
I had actually a question for you in regard to this Vairag, and I found it interesting how you brought in traditional scholars and quotes. What I want to ask from you is, as you study a concept like Vairag, how do you conceptualize some of the additional writings that Sikh scholars engage with when explaining these type of terms and loaded concepts? Like, for example, you mentioned Harbans Singh Nirmala. So within the Nirmala tradition, part of the curriculum is also a text called the Vairag Shatak, which is Braj, well, the ones they use are Braj translations or retellings of an old Sanskrit tale called Vairag Shataka. And this is used in their curriculum to explain these concepts of Vairag. But the traditions that those texts emerge out of are not exactly Sikh, and the way they frame renunciation is quite different to how you framed renunciation in a Sikh context. So my question is, how do you conceptualize, or how do you use texts that traditional Sikh scholars use, but also don't, are maybe not fully congruent with Sikh philosophy?
It's a tough question. I will try my best to answer it. So how I sort of approach this, if I'm being honest, is I would approach, again, these are people that have studied. So someone like me that hasn't sort of spent years and years studying every single text. So like the text you mentioned, if I'm being honest, I haven't heard of it. But how I sort of approached it was, okay, where does Vairag come up? And so looking at traditional sources was where I sort of had to go. And so to your question, where they don't line up with what Sikhi is saying, or what mainstream Sikhi says, I would say our understanding of Sikhi can sometimes be limited, where we think that Sikhi is just this one narrow path, which it is a narrow path, but Sikhi can be broad and Sikhi can be open to other ideas as well too.
Any other questions from the audience?
May I ask one?
Oh, please.
Yeah.
This is regarding the Dasam Granth, and I just would like to know which is the oldest source for the Dasam Granth, and are there multiple versions of the Granth, and how should we, as you don't know much about it, but kind of try to navigate and learn more about it?
Right. The oldest source for the Dasam Granth, the oldest dated Dasam manuscript?
Yeah.
As far as my knowledge, I didn't study manuscripts exactly, but I do know that at Patna Sahib, they have a manuscript there that's dated as 1699. Now, how do we know, or sorry, second question was, are there any differences in the manuscripts? There are. And there was a committee that was formed at the end of the 1800s, which did a lot of research as to the different manuscript versions of Dasam Granth that we had, and they produced a report on that. And it's from that report that we have printed, published versions of Dasam Granth today. So, for example, in the Patna Sahib manuscript, you have compositions in there that are not in the printed version today of the Dasam Granth. So some versions of the manuscript have additional compositions, some have less, but you know, at the end of the 1800s, they agreed upon a selection of composition that composed the Dasam Granth. So, for example, at Patna Sahib, you have the composition called the Gobind Gita, which is Guru Gobind Singh, or it's attributed to Guru Gobind Singh, his version of the Bhagavata Gita. And that's not in more modern prints of the Dasam Granth. And this is why a lot of research needs to be done on the Dasam Granth, because, I mean, Robin Reinhardt, who wrote a book on this called Debating Dasam Granth, I would encourage you to read that as a primary source, because, I mean, not as a primary source, but as a primary way of getting an introduction to the writings of the Dasam Granth. And she talks about, she outlines very, very nicely the debates around it, but also gives a thorough overview of the text and the compositions, what they talk about, even a little bit of comparative analysis between when they talk about the Charitra Pukyan, how does other texts similar. And so I would start there if anybody's looking about learning about what is the Dasam Granth. I would start at Robin Reinhardt's book.
With that, can we get a warm round of applause for our panelists? And we'll turn it back over to Jasmine.